In today's episode, one of the most experienced outdoorsmen of our times goes missing under some of the most unexplained circumstances. The theory that he was attacked by a wild animal is put to question after more and more evidence is found, leading some to believe his death was supernatural. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the mysterious death of Bart Schleyer. Welcome to Final Affliction. Bart's disappearance is a strange and frustrating mystery that's still considered one of the most unnerving disappearances in the Canadian wilderness to this day. A man capable of surviving the harshest Russian wilderness, and yet he disappeared in his own backyard. Bart Schleyer became fascinated with the outdoors as a young child when his father took him on a safari in Madagascar. Since that day, Bart's life was consumed by nature and hunting. He became an excellent hunter with the rifle, but his weapon of choice was the much more difficult crossbow. He even went on to study wildlife biology, earning himself a master's degree in the field. As an adult, he became famous for his tracking skills and was called in to find and dispatch some of the most dangerous animals in the world. He'd even been flown to Russia to locate and study the endangered Siberian tigers, where he spent months in what is arguably one of the roughest places in the world to be out in the open. That's where he met his wife and became a father. He moved his little family back to the United States, settling down in Alaska. Bart still regularly went out to lend his expertise in tracking large and elusive animals across the world. In September 2004, Bart left his home in Alaska and boarded a chartered plane that dropped him off in the Yukon Territory of Canada. He had all the necessary camping gear, food, radios for emergency contact, and more experience than almost anyone in the world to last comfortably for 2 weeks while he hunted moose. The Yukon wasn't new territory for Bart. He'd been there dozens of times and even had some favorite camping spots that he'd set aside for himself. But when the plane arrived 2 weeks later to take him back home, Bart was gone. And here's where things get strange. His campsite was still intact, though his tent had collapsed, probably knocked over by the wind. Strangely, all of his food was untouched. Even the plate that held the remains of his lunch was still sitting out in the open, just as he'd left it, except now it was sitting there rotting, completely untouched by scavengers. His radio had been left behind, so wherever he was, he couldn't call for help. If a wolf, bear, or even moose had gone through the camp, it's extremely unlikely that they wouldn't have rummaged through his open food containers. Searchers soon found a canoe that Bart had taken and paddled down the lake for half a mile. With his bow, a bag with supplies, and the clothes on his back, Bart stepped into the woods from there. His footprints were still visible in the soil. Tracking Bart from there, searchers found his bow leaning against a tree, as if Bart had just placed it there a moment ago. Next to it was his bag, full of gear, and a quiver full of arrows. It looked like Bart had set himself up comfortably to wait for the moose to come by that he wanted to hunt. A few feet farther, there was a bloodied face mask and some of Bart's hair. As much as this looked like a simple animal attack in the wilderness, there were several anomalies at the scene that makes this unlikely. For one, there was no body. If a bear had killed Bart, it would have hidden the remains in a cache in the immediate area, but search dogs found no trace of one. Wolves were another possibility, but the endangered animals aren't prone to attacking humans. Even if they had stormed him in a pack, then Bart would have at least have tried to shoot them. But there were no dead wolves or spent arrows anywhere to be seen, and certainly no human remains that were sure to be strewn around if a wolf had torn him apart. There were plenty of bear and wolf tracks around, but nowhere was there any sign of a struggle. No blood, no drag marks in the forest soil, and no scraps of clothes. Nothing but a face mask and a few strands of hair. 2 weeks after starting the search for Bart, something was finally found again. A skull fragment, some other small bones, and a baseball cap were just 60 meters away from the tree where Bart had set up to wait. All of the fragments and the cap belonged to Bart. but it was like they were just dumped there. For one, there were no teeth marks on any of the bones at all, and the pathologist agreed that there was no reason to believe that this was an animal attack based on the pieces that were in front of her. The areas where the bone fragments and cap were found had no blood, no pieces of clothing, and no disturbance of the forest floor, like there would have been if there had been a struggle. Every sample of bear and wolf scat in the vicinity was tested, and none of it contained human remains or clothes in it. If an animal had eaten Bart, then somewhere close by they would have found excrement that still held the evidence of an attack. But no, there was nothing. Bart was too experienced to allow an animal to sneak up on him, and bear and wolf attacks are a drawn-out and vicious affair. Neither species is known to bother waiting until their prey is dead before they start consuming them. The struggle and human remains after such an attack would have left behind a disturbance and a bloody scene that would be clearly visible for months afterward. It's as if Bart sat down, was taken up off his feet, and was taken away. Whoever or whatever took him came back later to dump some of his remains in the general area in a feeble attempt to blame it on an animal. Even if he was attacked, those shards of skull should have at least had flesh, hair, and blood on them. But it was so squeaky clean that it looked like it had been lying open on the ground for months. So let's reiterate, there wasn't a drop of blood anywhere, no corpse or any sign that a den had been dug to hide Bart's remains, no animal scat with human remains, no clothes found, no sign of a struggle on the ground. His camp, equipment, and food were all left untouched, and only 4 small fragments of bone were ever recovered, none of them having teeth marks left by animals. Every person who had ever worked with Bart before agreed that there was no way that the man could have been snuck up on by an animal, and if he were attacked head-on, Bart was the kind of guy who'd put up a hell of a struggle, and he'd probably win the fight too. Getting lost in the Yukon Valley is even less likely. He wouldn't have left every piece of equipment, even his knife, behind. By all accounts, Bart only had the clothes on his back when he disappeared. Even if he did get disoriented, he was experienced enough to be capable of getting himself to the road and flagging down help. It's not like the weather was against him. The lakeside experienced relatively mild temperatures and had no storms in the time he was camping there. The final possibility was that he'd suffered a heart attack or some other medical condition and was dragged away by animals after he'd died. But again, the lack of remains, blood, and soil disturbances throw a wrench in this theory. There's always human involvement. Maybe Bart met someone out there who had ill intentions, and that person tried to make it look like an animal attack. Or we can go to the extreme and say it was aliens. Who knows? Maybe a bear or a pack of wolves managed to catch the greatest hunter in the United States of America. Then the animal took off his clothes before devouring him. They'd have eaten every last scrap and licked up every drop of blood, leaving the scene only after they swept the ground clear of any evidence that they'd just consumed an entire human being. But what do you think? Are the conspiracy theories right? Was it aliens or an unknown mountain man who took Bart? Or had Bart Schleyer's reputation as an expert outdoorsman been overblown, and he was indeed killed by a wild animal? Let us know in the comments below what your theories are of how Bart Schleyer met his terrifying final affliction.